Welcome to this two-part lighting tutorial for Unreal Engine 5. I'm going to be using an environment called Spectrum Galaxy, but the principles apply to any other environment that you would like to work with. Before we start, I want to walk you through the environment so you become familiar with the spaces that we're going to be lighting. This modern lab area is good practice for lighting something that's completely enclosed. The workspaces and lounge area are good places to practice with different colors. They contain decorative elements that are good opportunities to create focal points with lighting. Right now we're looking at the daytime version of this map, but for the tutorial I want to focus on creating nighttime lighting. As you can see here, this command center area is partially open to the sky. The Grand Hall is a very open space, so we're going to be using sunlight primarily to light it. And finally, we're lighting the Suites Gallery, which is similar to a hotel corridor with panoramic views. This environment is available in the Unreal Engine Marketplace. It contains hundreds of modular pieces, IES profiles for lighting, PBR shaders, lens flares, and more. First, I want to show you the settings that I'm using for the post-process volume. These settings are already set on the included maps, but feel free to pause the video if you would like to copy any of these settings. I set the bloom method to convolution as it creates a very nice reflection on the floor. The exposure curve that I'm using here comes installed with the Unreal Engine. If you don't wish to use it, I would recommend setting the exposure compensation to 1 instead of 0. Here I'm using the film settings to remove some of the contrast. I'm going to turn it on and off so you can compare. Doing this will allow us to have more control over the contrast with the lighting. These lumen settings are not turned on by default in the project. You would need to checkmark them to use the high quality settings that I'm using here. Ultimately, I would recommend you to use the settings that work best for your system. Here I'm going to do a quick comparison between hardware and software ray tracing on this specific scene. As you can see here, when I toggle it on and off, the reflections change but the lighting stays the same. And finally, I have Extend Luminance Range turned on. We're going to be working with another map that is included. It's called Galaxy Simple Unlit. This is a version of the map that doesn't have any lighting, blueprints, or cinematics. To get started, we need to add a directional light and a skylight. The lighting that you're seeing on the ceiling comes from the emissive materials. We're going to be changing those later on in the tutorial. Now we're going to add a height fog, volumetric clouds, and a sky atmosphere. The volumetric clouds are using a material instance that is installed with the Unreal Engine. Feel free to make a copy if you would like to experiment with its settings. In this environment, I included 2 versions of this material that already have unique settings. I'm going to go ahead and apply one of them and show you how it looks like. It essentially lowers the density, tweaks the colors and shape of the clouds. I'm going to leave the night version of this material as I want less clouds in the sky in this nighttime scene. We're going to start by adjusting the directional light. I went ahead and moved it to the Grand Hall area as this is the space that is affected mostly by the sun. I'm going to rotate it so the sun is visible through the windows and you get long shadows for an added dramatic effect. I'm thinking of keeping this angle here. I like the way the foliage is highlighted and the reflections on the floor. Here we can see that the bloom being set to convolution adds a very unique glow on the floor. I adjusted the temperature to be cool for this nighttime scene. And finally, adjust the color and intensity until you find something that you like. Here, I'm using a dark blue and then decreasing the intensity of the sun. We can always come back to these values later on, but for now, I want to make sure that the entire environment is lit. Here, I rotated the sun, but I ended up keeping it in the same place. With the skylight selected, go ahead and checkmark real-time capture and make it movable. Here I lowered the sky distance threshold to 500 to make sure that the skylight captures the water underneath. Now we can move it to the exterior. Changing the sky atmosphere colors allows us to darken the sky so we see more of the stars. And we can see that all of the elements are starting to work together. And now for the volumetric clouds. I'm going to focus on these three settings. My goal is to lower the clouds, make them look softer, and not be as dense. This process is about experimenting with the values until you find something that you like. I'm planning to keep these values. If you would like to use them, feel free to pause the video. And now we're going to be working with the Exponential Height Fog. First, turn on volumetric fog. Otherwise, we might see fog in the interiors even when they're completely enclosed. It also creates a nice layering effect in the background elements. The in-scattering section and the volumetric fog is a really good way to introduce colors into the background. Here I'm using it to add warm colors to the areas that are closest to the sun. The two colors that I'm going to be changing is the directional and the fog in-scattering colors. Here I'm using the directional in-scattering exponent to affect the influence of the sun. At first I would recommend using a higher fog density as it allows you to see the colors and the gradients better, and afterwards you can tone it down. Here my goal is to get a gradient that goes from a warm orange into a blue that is slightly different from the sky. Now it's time to lower the density and make final adjustments to the colors. The fog height falloff is a good way to soften the horizon. The last thing I'll do is slightly darken the directional in-scattering color. Now that the sky is in place, I realized that I wanted to slightly increase the brightness of the sun. Now we're going to start placing other lights. Start by creating a rectangular light and dropping it into the large fixture and the command center area. My goal of this first pass is to get everything lit by focusing on the largest lights room by room. I'm starting to adjust the source width and height to get the shape of the light to be similar to the shape of the light fixture. Ultimately, I want to get an approximation of the shape, but what matters most is how it affects the environment. Oftentimes, I'll end up using a shape that is larger than the light source. I want this light to affect most of the room but still have a gradient that goes from light to dark. And that is primarily done through the attenuation radius. I'm setting the temperature of this area to be cool. I will recommend experimenting with source textures as a good way to add variety to the color and the brightness of the lights. The ones I'm showing here are blurry graphics that have interesting shapes and colors. You can easily make them by applying a Gaussian blur to your photos. Here I'm going to pick the one that is desaturated and then increase the brightness of the light. In this map, you'll find the light fixtures are turned on and the lens flares are already placed. I figured it would be easier to delete a light fixture that you do not need than it would be to create one and place it. Here I'm going to turn off this light fixture by simply replacing the emissive material with a plain metal. The fastest way to change this light strip material: first select all the SM strip light static meshes, right click, Asset Actions, and then select actors using this asset. But then I'm going to deselect the strips that are inside of these two rooms as I don't want them to be affected by this change. And finally, I'm going to assign the material that already exists in the content folders, but feel free to create a new one if you want a new color. I'm going to swap this graphic for something that works better for the room. These materials are highly customizable. As we can see here, we have a lot of variety, even though most of them derive from the same parent material. They also have a setting so you can plug in your own textures to use as wallpapers. This screen is one of the main lighting fixtures of this area. I'm going to start by duplicating the light that we already made and then adjust it to fit. One thing that I do very often is to adjust the lights from the main camera views. Essentially, these are views that you see in screenshots, cinematics, or when you play in the environment. Now I'm going to apply a source texture to this light that is similar to the graphic. An easy way to get the color is to sample directly from the graphic. I'm going to try to get that teal that is on the balloon. Now we're going to move on to the lounge and the workstations. Start off by adding a spotlight and then placing this in the center of the room. Then increase the cone angles to make it look like the light is coming from the strips. Even though Lumen created some light from the strips, it's good to supplement these with an actual light. I recommend you to experiment with the IES profiles. These allow you to change the shape of the light and you'll get some interesting gradients that go from lighter to dark. Spectrum Galaxy comes with several profiles that I'm going to be using. I usually just apply them one by one to see which one looks better. I ended up picking this one because I like the way it creates that circle on the floor. It almost looks like it's coming from the light strips. I'm also using the IES intensity and adjusting the brightness through the IES intensity scale. Now it's a matter of adjusting the temperature and the brightness to match the room. For this light, I'm going to increase the indirect lighting intensity. That allows me to decrease the regular intensity and the room is still bright. We can now duplicate this light and move it into the workstations area. The shape of this room is very similar, so the only thing we'll need to change is the color and the intensity of this light. I'm changing the temperature to 12,000 to make it cool, and afterwards I'm sampling the color from the light strip. Even though this color is matching the light strip, I want to make it a darker blue in order to give this room a different feel. Later on, when we do a detail lighting pass, we're going to be adding light to those monitors. But for now, in this pass, I just want to make sure that every space is lit. Now we're going to be working on the lab area. I'm going to start by duplicating this light and moving it to the large fixture in the center of the room. And similar to before, we're going to be looking at this light from the main camera angle. By default, when you create a new light, it is not set to movable, so I'm just going to go ahead and check that all of the lights are set correctly. For this one, I'm going to remove the source texture as I want the light and the shadows to be sharp. Overall, I want this room to be brighter than all the others. It's one of the benefits of having an isolated room is that you can really experiment with the looks. Now we can take this light and move it to the exterior, and then rotate it and scale it to match the overall size and shape of the window. The idea is to enhance the lighting that is coming from the exterior and get some interesting reflections on the floor, ceiling, and walls. This light can be much brighter, and we can also change the colors and the texture to make it look like it's coming from the exterior. As you can see here, I go back and forth between the two main camera angles in this area. This color is close enough for now. We can just copy this light and move it into the other window. And then we can do this again for the other windows that are larger in the grand hall area. Here we're going to need to adjust the shape, the size, and location of this light. When I brought this light closer, I realized that the color was not matching the sky, so I'm going to go ahead and change it again. I'm going to speed up this portion of the video as I duplicate this light to the other windows. I'm not doing this on every window as it's nice to see some that are darker than others. I'm still experimenting with the colors that are coming from the exterior. I felt the other ones were too purple, so I'm just making these more blue. I think this color feels more natural, so I'm just going to copy it over to the other lights. But before pasting the colors, I'm going to adjust the attenuation radius to make it smaller. and then adjust the same setting for these two other windows. I'm trying to get it to a point where it's lighting roughly half of the room, while the other half is being lit by this monitor. Again, we're going to duplicate this light and move it onto the grand hall. We're going to be using this as a start to light the graphics in this area. This is a similar workflow than before, we're just trying to match the source to make it look like it's lighting the environment. Because this area has more than one graphic, I'm going to try to make one of them more dominating than the others by making it brighter, more saturated, and increasing its radius. Here we can also replace the texture with something that matches the graphic better. By seeing the light from this camera angle, it's easier to notice that the saturation currently is too strong. This color is much more natural and it doesn't overpower the area. I'm going to speed up this portion of the video as I continue tuning this light. We're duplicating this again and applying a similar workflow for this other graphic. Going back to normal speed now, we're just going to modify the materials to make the graphics themselves brighter. Then we're speeding up again for the two remaining graphics. The main difference of this one here is that it's larger and more dominating than the others. Even though the main light is coming from this large graphic, we're still going to create new lights and place them to support these fixtures. Here we can spread out the cone angles, and then we can use the IES textures to further shape the light. One thing I wanted to highlight about these light fixtures is that the actual static meshes are not casting shadows. This allows me to put the light inside of the fixture itself. I'm also lowering the radius of this light. It's important to keep the radius to the amount that you need. The more overlapping that we have, the more expensive the lights can become. Here I'm using a profile that was made specifically for this area. This is a good place to compare the before and after and notice the difference that these textures can make. As you can see, the profile highlighted the pillars and also added a nice circular glow on the floor. I'm going to speed up this portion of the video as I duplicate this light, select them all, and continue adjusting. Once you reach a point that you're happy with, feel free to copy these lights into the other side. Here we can replace the light strip material. I wanted to make the colors more warm, so I ended up selecting all of these and then sampling from the fixture itself. Usually when the color is changed, it changes the brightness, so it would need to be adjusted. We're actually very close to finishing the first pass. We just need to light the tunnel that connects to the elevator. We can start by duplicating one of these spotlights and moving it down. This area is also completely enclosed. It's a good opportunity to try different colors to contrast with the rest of the environment. I'm gonna speed up this portion of the video as the workflow is similar to what we've done in other areas. The main difference here is that we're gonna be adding a light fixture and a lens flare. All these lens flares are customizable. You can edit them by opening the material instance that the particle is referencing. There's a setting called Scale with Distance that is usually used just for sunlights because you want the particle to stay the same size even if you move it far away. Otherwise, you can leave that off. For other lens flares, you want them to become small as you move further away. I'm going to speed up the video as I duplicate this light and adjust it for the exit of the command center. When lighting environments, it's good to consider which areas to contrast with the rest of the environment. In this case, this exit is important as it takes you to the grand hall. In this portion, I want to briefly explain light channels. By default, when you create a new light or a mesh, they're set to channel 0. It's only when the channels match that the light and the mesh interact. In this case, I'm going to use channels to brighten up the moons, so what I'm going to do is select them both and apply channel 1 and channel 0. Then duplicate the main sunlight, remove channel 0 and add channel 1. Make sure this light does not affect indirect lighting or the atmosphere. If set up correctly, when you adjust this light, only the moons will change. At this moment, I realized that I would like to change the composition and make one of them very large. The scale of these is very large as I would like them to be far away and appear like they're behind the atmosphere. The texture on this is very smooth, so I'm gonna apply something else. Feel free to use the ones that are available or customize these to fit your needs. To the smaller moon, I'm gonna apply another material called Dying Star. The idea is that this is the main sunlight, but much dimmer. Here I'm gonna use one of the lens flares that adjusts with scale. Any of them can do that. All you need to do is go to the material instance and checkmark that setting. I'm continually checking this from the interior, just to make sure everything is correct. And now it's time for the final adjustment to the brightness of the moon. Also adjust the colors to bring them closer to the main light source. With every part of the environment having light, we finished the first pass. Now we're just going to add 2 more lights to add more detail to this area, and then we can conclude the first part of this tutorial. Now we're creating a new point light. At first, I was thinking of lighting this area behind the consoles, but you'll see I'll end up moving this light to the center of the room on the center console itself. Here I'm broadening the reflection and softening the shadows by using the soft source radius and the source radius. Even though this light was moved to the center console, these settings stayed the same. Overall, the softness of this light is working. Now we can adjust the color, the position, the intensity, and limit the influence of this light. We can apply a light profile, and that is going to limit the influence of this light. The end result is going to be a very soft looking spotlight. Adding new lights usually means that we need to go back and adjust the ones that we added earlier. I'm going to lower the radius of this light so there's not as much overlapping with the new light on the console. Thank you for watching. This concludes the first part of the tutorial. We covered a lot in these 30 minutes, so we can take a break and then come back and continue doing a detailed pass.